The radio crackled with static, then silence. Major Kellerman stood in the operations center at Bagram Airfield, his jaw tight as he stared at the digital map flickering on the screen before him. 43 minutes had passed since Captain Myra Volkov's last transmission. The A-10 Thunderbolt II she'd been flying, call sign Reaper 6, had vanished from radar somewhere over the Kunar Valley, a place where mountains rose like broken teeth and insurgents knew every cave, every ridge, every kill zone. The major's hand hovered over the radio transmit button, then fell away. He'd already sent 2 search and rescue birds. They'd found nothing but smoke and the charred remains of what might have been her aircraft scattered across a remote hillside. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of a decision no commander wanted to make. Mark Captain Volkov as missing, presumed KIA. Notify her squadron. The room fell silent. Someone in the back muttered a prayer. Another pilot, a lieutenant with barely a year in theater, shook his head slowly. They all knew Volkov, the woman who flew low and slow, who'd earned her call sign not through bravado but through 15 confirmed gun runs that had saved more ground units than anyone could count. She was the one they'd called when the situation was already lost, when conventional air support couldn't get close enough, when only the Warthog's titanium bathtub cockpit and Gatling gun could make a difference. But now she was gone. Except she wasn't. 217 miles away, Myra Volkov lay on her back beneath a camouflage tarp, her flight suit torn at the shoulder, her helmet cracked down the center. Blood had dried along her hairline. Above her, the twisted wreckage of Reaper 6 groaned in the wind, one wing sheared completely off, the other bent at an angle that defied physics. She'd managed to keep the aircraft aloft for 11 minutes after the RPG struck her port engine, long enough to clear the village below, long enough to aim for something that wasn't populated. The impact had been catastrophic. She remembered the mountain rushing up, the instrument panel shattering, the sensation of her body being thrown forward against the harnesses hard enough to crack ribs. Then darkness. When she woke, the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of amber and blood. Her radio was destroyed. Her ejection seat had failed to separate. She was alone in hostile territory with a broken aircraft and a body that screamed with every breath. The first night Myra didn't move. Pain radiated from her chest with each shallow inhale, and she knew at least 3 ribs were fractured, possibly more. Her left wrist was swollen, the joint refusing to rotate properly. But her legs worked, her vision was clear, and most importantly, her mind remained sharp. She'd trained for this scenario 1,000 times: survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The acronym SEER had been drilled into her until it became reflex rather than memory. As moonlight filtered through the tarp, she took inventory. One sidearm, a Beretta M9 with 2 magazines. A survival knife strapped to her calf. A small medical kit, miraculously intact, tucked into her vest. 3 protein bars, a water purification pen, and a signal mirror. It wasn't much, but she'd worked with less during training exercises in the Nevada desert. The difference was that here, the enemy wasn't playing by training rules, and extraction wasn't guaranteed. She thought about her squadron, about the pilots who'd probably already written her off. The thought stung more than the physical pain. Myra had always been the outsider, the female pilot in a community that paid lip service to equality but rarely meant it. She'd heard the whispers, too cautious, too methodical, not aggressive enough. They'd never said it to her face, but she'd felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered the ready room, in the assignments she didn't get, in the subtle skepticism that colored every mission briefing. Her call sign, Reaper, had been given reluctantly, only after her 6th confirmed kill, as if they'd needed overwhelming proof before acknowledging what she could do. But she'd never let their doubt become her doubt. Every flight, every mission, every moment in the cockpit was a silent refusal to accept their limitations on who she could be. Dawn arrived with the sound of voices. Myra froze beneath the tarp, her hand moving slowly to the Beretta. 2 men, maybe 3, speaking in Pashto. They were searching the wreckage, their footsteps crunching over debris. She could hear metal scraping against rock, the sound of someone climbing into what remained of the cockpit. Her heart hammered against her damaged ribs, each beat a fresh wave of agony. If they found her, it was over. She'd seen the videos, knew what happened to captured pilots. Death would be a mercy compared to what they'd do first. The voices grew louder, closer. Someone kicked a piece of fuselage near her hiding spot. Myra's finger found the trigger, her breathing shallow and controlled. She'd take as many as she could before they took her. It was the only equation that mattered now. Then, unexpectedly, the voices retreated. She heard an engine starting, a truck or motorcycle, and gradually the sounds faded down the mountain. Myra waited 30 minutes before moving, counting each second to ensure they were truly gone. When she finally crawled from beneath the tarp, her body protested every movement, but she forced herself upright. The wreckage of Reaper 6 looked worse in daylight, a twisted sculpture of titanium and broken dreams scattered across the mountainside. She allowed herself one moment of grief for the aircraft that had saved her life even in its death, then turned her attention to survival. The valley below was a patchwork of brown and green, villages connected by dirt roads that snaked through terrain where ambushes were easy and escape nearly impossible. To the north, higher peaks rose into low clouds. That was her direction, away from population centers, toward the possibility of reaching friendly forces or a position where her signal mirror might catch the attention of a passing aircraft. She moved slowly, using rocks and sparse vegetation for cover, stopping every 50 meters to listen and observe. The sun climbed higher, turning the landscape into a furnace. By midday, Myra's water was gone, the purification pen useless without a source. Her ribs felt like broken glass shifting with each step. Twice she heard helicopters in the distance, but they were too far away, and using the signal mirror risked drawing the wrong kind of attention. As afternoon shadows lengthened, she found a small cave, barely more than an overhang, and collapsed inside. Her body was failing, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally depleting. She knew the statistics. Survival rates for downed pilots in hostile territory dropped precipitously after 72 hours. She'd already lost 24. The numbers weren't encouraging, but numbers had never intimidated her. She'd been told the odds her entire career, told what she couldn't do, couldn't be, couldn't achieve. And she'd proven them wrong every single time. Night brought cold that seeped into her bones. Myra huddled in the cave, her flight suit providing inadequate insulation against the mountain chill. She thought about her father, a mechanic who'd never understood why she wanted to fly, who'd warned her the military would chew her up and spit her out. She thought about her first flight instructor, a retired Navy pilot who'd actually believed in her, who taught her that flying wasn't about strength or aggression, but about understanding the machine, becoming part of it, letting it speak to you through stick and throttle. And she thought about the ground units she'd covered, the soldiers who'd called for her when the situation turned desperate, who trusted Reaper 6 to arrive through weather and fire and impossible odds. That trust was sacred. It was why she'd pushed the damaged aircraft past its limits, why she'd chosen this mountain over the village, why she was still fighting now when surrender would be easier. The second day began with blood in her urine and a fever building behind her eyes. Internal injuries, probably kidney damage from the impact. Myra forced herself to move despite knowing her body was shutting down. She climbed higher, using the sun's position to maintain a northern heading, rationing the protein bars into mouthfuls that barely sustained her. By afternoon, she'd reached a ridge that offered a vantage point across miles of valley. She could see roads, vehicles moving, the sprawl of a larger town to the east, and something else, a plume of dust to the northwest, multiple vehicles moving in formation. American convoy. Her heart surged despite the fever, despite the pain. She pulled out the signal mirror, hands shaking as she angled it toward the distant vehicles. 3 flashes, pause, 3 flashes, the universal distress signal. She repeated it until her arms couldn't hold the mirror steady anymore, then collapsed against a rock, chest heaving. The convoy didn't deviate from its course. Either they hadn't seen her signal, or they'd mistaken it for something else. Myra watched them disappear into the haze, feeling hope drain away. She was running out of time, out of strength, out of options. That night the fever peaked. She drifted in and out of consciousness, dreaming of cockpits and clouds, of the moment when wheels leave runway and gravity loses its claim. In her delirium, she heard her father's voice telling her to come home, heard her instructor explaining the proper angle for a strafing run, heard the radio chatter of missions flown years ago. When dawn came, she barely had the strength to open her eyes. Her skin was hot to the touch, her vision blurred. She knew the signs of septic shock, understood her body was losing the fight. Still, she forced herself to sit up, to face the sun rising over the mountains. If this was where she'd make her stand, she'd do it on her feet looking toward home. Then she heard it, the distinctive sound of turbofan engines, low and aggressive. An aircraft close enough that the sound echoed off the valley walls. Myra struggled upright, fumbling for the signal mirror even as her coordination failed. The sound grew louder and then she saw it. An A-10 Thunderbolt II gray paint scheme weathered from countless missions, flying a search pattern over the valley. Her aircraft, her kind. She raised the mirror with both hands, angling it desperately toward the warthog. The sun caught the glass, sent a brilliant flash across the sky. Once, twice, 3 times. The A-10 continued its pattern, and for a moment Myra thought she'd failed again. Then the aircraft banked hard left, turning directly toward her position. The pilot had seen the signal. Someone was coming. Myra collapsed to her knees, the mirror falling from her hands, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face. She was going to survive after all. But survival, she would learn, was only the beginning of the story. The A-10 made 3 passes over her position, low enough that she could see the pilot's helmet in the cockpit, before climbing and circling higher. Within 30 minutes, she heard the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors. A Pave Hawk appeared over the ridge, fast movers providing top cover as the rescue bird descended into the narrow valley. The rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust and debris. Myra shielded her eyes, watching as 2 PJs fast-roped down, their weapons scanning for threats as they moved toward her position. The first one to reach her was a senior airman with a thick beard and kind eyes. He knelt beside her, hands already assessing injuries. "Captain Volkov," his voice carried surprise. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Reaper 6. The medic's expression shifted to something like awe. "Ma'am, they declared you KIA 2 days ago. This is going to be one hell of a story." They had her strapped into a litter within minutes, moving with practiced efficiency despite the exposed position. The hoist lifted her toward the helicopter, the mountains falling away below. As they climbed, Myra caught one last glimpse of Reaper 6's wreckage, already being reclaimed by the landscape. Then the crew chief was pulling her inside, the door gunner watching their 6, and they were banking hard toward home. The flight to Bagram took 40 minutes. Myra drifted in and out, the morphine the PJs had administered creating a warm buffer between her and the pain. She heard radio chatter, excited voices confirming her identity, disbelief that she'd survived. Someone mentioned Major Kellerman, said he'd been notified. The thought of facing her commanding officer after being declared dead brought a strange mixture of anxiety and satisfaction. She'd proven something, though she wasn't yet sure what. When they landed, a medical team was waiting. They transferred her from the helicopter to a gurney with practiced speed, vitals being called out, IV lines already flowing. Someone placed an oxygen mask over her face. The world became a blur of overhead lights and urgent voices. She heard fragments, internal bleeding, possible kidney rupture, multiple fractures, but the words seemed distant, unconnected to her body. As they wheeled her into surgery, her last conscious thought was of the sky, and the sound of turbofan engines, and the knowledge that she'd kept flying even after the aircraft was gone. She woke 3 days later in a hospital bed, her torso wrapped in bandages, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that beeped with steady rhythm. Major Kellerman sat in a chair by the window, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. When he noticed her eyes open, he stood and approached the bed. "Captain." His voice was careful, controlled. "Sir," speaking hurt, but she managed it. They studied each other in silence. Finally, Kellerman shook his head slowly. "I wrote the letter to your family. Signed it myself. Told them you died doing what you loved, that your sacrifice saved lives. I had it ready to mail." Myra waited, unsure where this was going. And then you show up, he continued, something between frustration and admiration in his tone. 3 days alone in hostile territory with internal injuries that should have killed you. The doctors say another 12 hours and you wouldn't have made it. I'm hard to kill, sir. A ghost of a smile touched his face. Apparently. The pilot who spotted your signal, Lieutenant Reeves, he's been telling everyone who'll listen. Says you're the toughest son of a bitch he's ever met. His words, not mine. Myra felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with broken ribs. Respect. Actual, genuine respect. It was foreign and familiar all at once. The aircraft, she started. Total loss, Kellerman interrupted. But you put it down in the only place that wouldn't have caused civilian casualties. The ground commander in that area sent a personal commendation. Says Reaper 6 provided cover for his unit's extraction 2 hours before you were hit. Saved 37 soldiers. He paused. Your actions after the crash demonstrated exceptional survival skills and dedication to returning to friendly forces. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The room seemed to tilt slightly. The DFC was one of the highest awards for aerial achievement, rarely given, never given lightly. I don't need a medal, sir, I just did my job. I know, Kellerman said quietly. That's why you're getting one. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Volkov, I owe you an apology. I should have sent more assets sooner. Should have trusted my gut that you'd find a way to survive. Instead, I wrote you off too quickly. You made the call any commander would make with the information available. Maybe, but maybe I made it easier than I should have because, he trailed off, because she was a woman, because he'd never fully believed she belonged in that cockpit. He didn't say it, but they both understood. Permission to speak freely, sir. Granted. Don't let guilt change how you see me. I don't want special treatment. I want to be evaluated on what I can do, same as everyone else. What happened out there, that's who I've always been. You just hadn't seen it yet. Kellerman absorbed this, then nodded once. Noted. Recover quickly, Captain. Your squadron's waiting for you. After he left, Myra lay in the quiet hospital room processing everything. The pain medication created a floating sensation, but her mind remained clear. She thought about the 3 days on the mountain, about the choice she'd made to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. It wasn't heroism, not really. It was simply refusal. Refusal to accept the limitations others placed on her. Refusal to let circumstances define her outcome. Refusal to be anything less than what she knew herself capable of being. The door opened again, and this time it was Lieutenant Reeves, the pilot who'd spotted her signal. He was young, maybe 26, with the lean build and confident posture of someone who'd never doubted his place in the cockpit. Captain Volkov. He approached hesitantly as if she might be fragile. I'm Reeves. I'm glad I found you. Thank you for not giving up on the search pattern. Are you kidding? After what I heard about your gun runs, no way I was leaving that valley without making sure. He shifted his weight. Can I ask you something? Myra nodded. How'd you keep it together out there? 3 days alone, injured, no comms. That's nightmare fuel. She considered the question carefully. I didn't think about the 3 days. I thought about the next hour, then the next, breaking it into pieces small enough to handle. And I thought about all the people who said I couldn't hack it as a combat pilot. Every time I wanted to quit, I pictured their faces and decided I wasn't giving them that satisfaction. Reeves laughed, surprised by her honesty. That's hardcore, ma'am. That's survival. Sometimes spite is the best motivation. After he left, Myra closed her eyes and let herself finally relax. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, the morphine pulled her toward sleep, and for the first time in days, she felt safe. The next weeks passed in a blur of physical therapy and debriefings. Intelligence officers wanted every detail of her time on the mountain, what she'd seen, what she'd heard, any information that might prove tactically useful. Medical staff monitored her recovery with cautious optimism. The internal injuries were healing, the ribs mending, though she'd carry the scars forever. And her squadron visited, one by one and in small groups, their attitudes subtly changed. The skepticism had been replaced by something else, something that looked like camaraderie forged through fire. They asked about the crash, about her survival, but mostly they just sat with her. sharing stories from recent missions, treating her like one of them in a way they never quite had before. 6 weeks after the crash, Myra was cleared to return to light duty. She walked into the operations center at Bagram feeling strangely nervous, as if returning to a place that had fundamentally changed during her absence. The room fell silent when she entered. Then someone started clapping. Another pilot joined in, then another, until the entire room erupted in applause. Myra stood frozen, overwhelmed by the unexpected reception. Major Kellerman appeared from his office, a rare smile on his face. "Welcome back, Reaper." The use of her call sign, spoken with respect rather than the grudging acknowledgement she'd grown accustomed to, hit harder than she'd expected. She managed a nod, not trusting her voice. That afternoon, she attended her first flight briefing since the crash. The mission was straightforward: close air support for a ground operation near Ghazni. 4 aircraft standard combat spread, with Myra slated as number 3 in the formation. She listened to the tactical breakdown, studied the maps, absorbed the rules of engagement. It felt like coming home. When the briefing concluded, the flight lead, a captain named Tors who'd always been professional but distant, pulled her aside. "Good to have you back, Volkov. You ready for this?" "Been ready since week 3 of recovery," Tors grinned. "I believe it. Listen, I want you on my wing for this one." The ground commander specifically requested Reaper 6 after hearing what happened. Says he trusts you more than anyone else in theater. The confidence, the trust, the recognition. It was everything she'd worked for, everything she'd fought to earn. Copy that. I won't let him down. "I know you won't. That's why I'm asking." The flight line at dawn was organized chaos, maintenance crews performing final checks, ordnance teams loading weapons, pilots conducting walk-arounds of their aircraft. Myra approached her new bird, tail number different but the airframe identical to the one she'd put into the mountain. A ground crewman had stenciled Reaper 6 beneath the canopy rail, the letters fresh and proud. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rivets under her palm, the slight texture of the paint. This machine was a weapon, a shield, a lifeline. In her hands it became all three simultaneously. The pre-flight was ritual and meditation combined, checking control surfaces, testing avionics, ensuring every system responded correctly. When she finally climbed into the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat and pulling the harness tight, something inside her that had been tense since the crash finally relaxed. This was her element, her domain, the place where doubt had no power and only skill mattered. The engine spun up with its characteristic whine, turbofans building to their distinctive roar. Tower cleared them for takeoff. Myra released brakes and felt the aircraft surge forward, acceleration pressing her back into the seat. The runway fell away and suddenly she was flying again, the earth dropping below as she climbed into morning sky painted gold and pink. Tor's voice came through her helmet. "Reaper 6, check in. 6 is up, systems green. Copy. Welcome back, Myra." The use of her first name over tactical frequency was a violation of protocol and a gesture of respect all at once. She smiled inside her oxygen mask and banked to join the formation. Below, Afghanistan spread out in browns and greens, beautiful and lethal, familiar as her own reflection. The mission itself was textbook. The ground unit made contact with insurgents dug into a compound on the outskirts of Ghazni. Tors took lead, marking the target with white phosphorus rockets. Myra followed in trail, her Maverick missile guidance system locked on the designated building. She watched the display, waited for tone, then squeezed the trigger. The missile dropped clean, motor igniting, tracking straight into the compound. Secondary explosions bloomed, indicating stored ammunition. The ground controller's voice crackled through the radio. "Direct hit, Reaper 6. Target destroyed. Hostiles are breaking contact. You just saved a lot of lives down here." Simple words, but they carried weight that transcended their brevity. This was why she flew, why she'd chosen this path despite every obstacle and doubt. Not for glory or recognition, but for moments like this when skill and timing meant the difference between soldiers going home or not. The formation returned to Bagram as the sun reached its zenith, heat shimmering off the runway. Myra landed with practiced precision, the main gear chirping against concrete, nose wheel settling as she deployed the drag chute. Rolling out, she felt the familiar satisfaction of a mission completed, a job done right. In the debrief, Kellerman reviewed their performance with his typical attention to detail, noting what went well and what could improve. But when he reached Myra's segment, he simply said, "Textbook execution, Captain. Exactly what we needed." No qualifiers, no subtle skepticism, just acknowledgement of competence. It was, in its own way, the highest praise he could offer. That evening, Myra sat outside her quarters watching the sun descend toward the mountains. The base was quieter at this hour, the constant operational tempo briefly subsiding. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, years of training, countless hours proving herself, the crash that had nearly ended everything, and the slow climb back to this moment. She thought about the pilots who'd doubted her and the ones who'd believed, about the ground troops who trusted Reaper 6 to arrive when needed most. And she thought about her younger self, the girl who'd stood at an airshow watching A-10s perform and decided that's what she wanted to be, regardless of what anyone said about women in combat aviation. That girl would be proud of who she'd become. The door to the adjacent quarters opened and Lieutenant Reeves emerged, pausing when he saw her. "Mind if I join you?" Myra gestured to the empty chair. They sat in companionable silence, watching the light fade. Finally, Reeves spoke. "You know what people are saying about you. They're calling you the ghost, the pilot who came back from the dead. There's talk of writing articles, maybe even a book." Myra grimaced. "I don't want to be famous, I just want to fly." "Too late for that. You're already a legend, but if it helps, everyone's focused on the right things. Your skill, your determination, your refusal to quit. Not your gender or anything else that doesn't matter in the cockpit. That's all I ever wanted. To be evaluated on merit, nothing more, nothing less." Reeves nodded thoughtfully. "For what it's worth, you've changed how a lot of people think, myself included. I grew up hearing that women weren't suited for combat roles, that they didn't have the right temperament or physical capability. Then I watched you survive something that would have killed most pilots, and I realized how much garbage I'd internalized without questioning it. We all carry biases we don't recognize until they're challenged," Myra said quietly. "The important thing is being willing to change when confronted with evidence." The weeks became months, and Myra fell into the rhythm of deployment. Missions, briefings, maintenance issues, the occasional mortar attack that sent everyone scrambling for bunkers. She flew 53 combat sorties before her rotation ended, each one adding to her reputation as the pilot ground forces wanted overhead when situations turned critical. The DFC arrived in a formal ceremony that made her uncomfortable with its attention, but that she endured for the sake of her squadron. Major Kellerman pinned the medal to her uniform, his handshake firm and genuine. "You've earned this twice over, Captain. Your service honors everyone who wears this uniform." The words were standard ceremony language, but his eyes held sincerity that transcended formality. After the medal presentation, her squadron threw a party in the ready room, unauthorized alcohol smuggled in, crude jokes, and the kind of camaraderie that only develops among people who have faced death together. Myra found herself at the center of it, no longer the outsider looking in but a fully integrated member of the team. Tours raised a contraband beer. "To Reaper 6, may she always roll in scarred but defiant." The toast was taken up by the entire room, and Myra felt tears threatening despite her best efforts to maintain composure. This was what she'd fought for, not the medal or the recognition, but this moment of belonging, of being seen as an equal by the people whose respect mattered most. Lieutenant Reeves approached as the party wound down. "I'm putting in for the A-10 program when my current assignment ends. Wanted you to know your story was part of why. Make sure it's what you want, not just what looks good." "It is. I realized I want to fly an aircraft where the mission is protecting people on the ground, where every sortie has immediate impact. Watching you work showed me that's the kind of pilot I want to be." Myra's deployment ended on a morning that dawned clear and cold, the mountains sharp against a sky that seemed impossibly blue. She performed her final walk-around of the aircraft she'd flown for the past 6 months, memorizing details she knew would fade with time but wanted to hold on to. The ground crew chief, A master sergeant who'd kept her aircraft mission-ready through sandstorms and rocket attacks, shook her hand. "It's been an honor, ma'am. Reaper 6 is the bird everyone wants to crew. Feels like we're maintaining something that matters. You kept me alive up there. That matters more than you know." The flight back to the States was long and cramped, military transport lacking any pretense of comfort. But Myra didn't mind. She was going home, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd proven everything she'd set out to prove, not to the doubters or the skeptics, but to herself. She'd faced the worst circumstances and emerged intact, scarred but not broken, changed but still fundamentally herself. At Dover Air Force Base, her father waited in the terminal, older than she remembered, his mechanic's hand still bearing traces of engine grease that no amount of washing fully removed. When he saw her, his face crumpled with an emotion he'd never been good at expressing. They embraced without words, and Myra felt something inside her that had been holding tension for years finally release. "I'm sorry," he said when they finally separated, "for not understanding, for trying to talk you out of this. I was wrong. You were scared for me. That's just love wearing a different face." He smiled through tears. "Your mother would be proud. Hell, I'm proud, my daughter the war hero. Just a pilot, Dad. That's all I ever wanted to be. You're a lot more than that, but I'm learning to accept you see things differently than I do. Come on, let's get you home." Home was a small house in Pennsylvania that smelled of coffee and old wood, the place she'd grown up dreaming of sky and distance. It felt smaller now, contained in a way that her life had ceased being, but also comforting in its familiarity. That first night back, she slept in her childhood bed, surrounded by posters of aircraft and old trophies from track meets, and dreamed of mountains and clouds and the sound of turbofan engines. The transition to stateside duty was harder than she'd anticipated. Training squadrons, flight evaluations, endless paperwork, all necessary but lacking the immediacy and purpose of combat operations. She found herself restless, missing the clarity that came from missions where success and failure had concrete meaning. But she adapted, the same way she'd adapted to every challenge throughout her career. She became an instructor, teaching new pilots the skills that had kept her alive, trying to instill not just technical proficiency, but the mental resilience that mattered more than any checklist. And she spoke, when asked, about her experience on the mountain, about survival and determination, and the importance of refusing to accept other people's limitations as your own. The story spread despite her efforts to remain low profile. Journalists requested interviews, which she mostly declined. But eventually, a documentary filmmaker approached with a proposal that intrigued her, not a story about her personally, but about women in combat aviation, using her experience as one thread in a larger narrative. She agreed, with conditions that the focus remain on the work rather than sensationalism. The filming process was uncomfortable, answering personal questions, revisiting memories she'd tried to compartmentalize. But when she saw the finished documentary, she understood its value. Young women wrote to her afterward, saying they'd decided to pursue military aviation, that her story had given them courage to attempt something they'd been told was impossible. Each letter reminded her that impact extended beyond the immediate mission, that representation mattered in ways both subtle and profound. 5 years after the crash, Myra returned to Afghanistan, not as a combat pilot but as part of a military advisory group evaluating close air support effectiveness. The landscape hadn't changed, still beautiful and hostile, still a place where mountains rose like ancient sentinels and every valley held potential danger. She insisted on visiting the crash site, despite logistics personnel trying to dissuade her. The wreckage was gone, salvaged or scattered by time and weather, but she recognized the ridge, the angle of the slope, the rock formation she'd hidden behind that first terrible night. Standing there in the thin mountain air, she felt the weight of what she'd survived settle over her like a familiar coat. This place had nearly been her grave. Instead, it had become her crucible, the point where everything she'd been tested and found sufficient. A young army captain accompanying her asked, "Is it strange being back here?" Strange isn't the right word. Meaningful, maybe. This is where I learned I was stronger than I thought, where I proved to myself that all the doubt and skepticism didn't define my capabilities. We all need moments like that, where we discover who we actually are versus who we've been told we are. I think I understand. I had a moment like that last year during a contact in Helmand. Everything went wrong, and I had to make decisions I wasn't sure I was ready for. But I did, and we all made it out. Myra smiled. That's exactly it. Those crucible moments, they reshape you, not breaking you but forging you into something different, something tested. They stood together on the mountain where she'd nearly died, watching the sun trace shadows across the valley, and Myra felt a sense of completion. This place no longer held power over her. It was simply a location, marked by coordinates and history, part of her story but not its conclusion. Back at Bagram, now significantly expanded from her deployment years earlier, she met with current A-10 squadrons. The pilots were younger than she remembered being, their faces still holding the optimism that combat experience would eventually temper. But when she walked into the ready room, they stood as one, recognition evident in their eyes. The squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel who'd been a captain during her deployment, stepped forward. "Captain Volkov, sorry. Major Volkov, now welcome home. This squadron flies under your legacy every day. We have your call sign on the wall, part of our heritage. Every new pilot learns about Reaper 6 before they fly their first combat mission." Myra looked at the wall he indicated, seeing her call sign painted among others who distinguished themselves. Pilots who'd paid the ultimate price, who'd performed acts of extraordinary courage, who'd defined what it meant to serve with honor. Seeing her name among them created a complex emotion she struggled to process. "I don't know what to say, I just did my job." "Ma'am, with respect, you did a lot more than that. You showed us that when everything goes wrong, when the aircraft's dying and you're alone in hostile territory with injuries that should have killed you, there's still a choice. You can quit, or you can keep fighting. Every pilot in this squadron has heard that story. It matters more than you know." They insisted on a briefing where she shared tactical lessons from her experience. The importance of maintaining heading despite catastrophic damage, the value of prioritizing civilian safety even in extremis, the survival techniques that had kept her alive. But mostly, she talked about mental resilience, about breaking overwhelming situations into manageable pieces, about the power of refusing to accept defeat until defeat was the only option remaining. A young lieutenant in the back row raised her hand. "Major, did you ever doubt yourself? During training, during your first deployment, during the crash?" Myra considered the question carefully. "Every day, doubt is human. The question isn't whether you doubt yourself, but whether you let that doubt control your actions. I doubted I was good enough, strong enough, brave enough. But I never let those doubts make my decisions. I acknowledged them, then did the work anyway." The evening before leaving Afghanistan for the final time, Myra borrowed a flight suit and walked to the flight line. The A-10s sat in their revetments, gray shapes in the gathering dark, weapons loaded and ready for night missions. She approached the nearest aircraft, running her hand along the fuselage the way she had hundreds of,